whoever keeps the word of Christ, the love of God is truly perfected in him. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one as well. And if anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand over your cloak as well. Should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go for 2 miles. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn your back on the one who wants to borrow. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes the sun rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not tax collectors do the same? And if you only greet your brothers or sisters, what is unusual about that? Do not pagans do the same? So be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Very good evening to everyone. I don't know how many of you were here last week, Sunday, for the 6:30 Mass. I was here, which is something that doesn't happen that often. You know, with so many priests here, you know, it might be like once a month you get a chance to be at the 6:30 Mass, but it just so happens that I'm here 2 weeks in a row. And I'm glad I have that opportunity because I can test you all on last Sunday's Gospel to make sure that you all remembered it. Because today's Gospel is a continuation of last Sunday's Gospel. It picks up where Jesus left off. And if you remember, I'll remind you. What Jesus said in last Sunday's Gospel was he took 3 Old Testament commandments against adultery. Now someone's going to have to help me because I'm not remembering myself. Does someone remember? It was against adultery, against taking oaths. And what was the first one? Pardon? Thou shalt not kill. Thank you very much. So those were the 3 commandments last week. And what Jesus did is he took those 3 commandments and he didn't change them, but he gave a deeper understanding to them. And, like the one about adultery. He said, and you said before, you shall not commit adultery. What I say to you, if you even look at another person with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery in your heart. And I reflected upon it with you and said what Jesus was calling us to do was impossible. It's easy to say, well, I've never killed anyone, but to say, I've never got angry with anyone, none of us could say that we've never got angry with another person. And I use the example of just drive on the 605 and you're going to get angry at somebody. But if you remember, I said because of the fact that what Jesus is calling us to do is so difficult, and if we're asked to do something very difficult, like I use the example of if I wanted 100,000 tamales tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., what would we do? We'd ask for help. We'd ask for help for one another and also help from our God. And so Jesus, he continues on with the gospel message this Sunday, doing the same thing, taking these Old Testament commandments and giving a new understanding to them. But the thing is, last week Jesus was telling us what we shouldn't do. This week Jesus is telling us what we should do. And you know what? It only gets more difficult. It only gets more impossible. This first commandment, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What Jesus is talking about is vengeance. He says, in the way that we treat one another, we can't be vengeful. And what's the opposite of vengeance? That's what I asked you to do at the beginning of Mass. Forgiveness. Rather than be vengeful towards another person, we're called to be forgiving. Now, as I was reflecting on that, I'm thinking there might be some things that I say this evening that make you feel uncomfortable, and I think that's good because I think the gospel should make us feel uncomfortable. But this example of vengeance, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it comes from Exodus 21, and it's even more complete in Exodus 21. It says a hand for a hand and a foot for a foot, a life for a life. It's interesting when it talks about taking the life of your wife, it's the man who gets to decide what the punishment is for taking your wife. But it's just the law of retribution. Someone does something against you, and you have the right to do the same thing against them. So, to take an example, I think most of you probably know that Saturday morning, at the 7-Eleven, 5:30 in the morning, the clerk who was working there was killed. She was there, innocent. I was thinking it was a woman. I try to find out the person's name. I don't know what the person's name is. I don't know if it's been released. But the person who was working at 7-Eleven was killed, and the person who killed him is still at large. And when we hear that, what's our first response? I hope that they go away forever. They lock up and throw them away, and lock them up and throw away the key. Or we think, maybe they should reinstate the death penalty. That's vengeance. That's kind of the natural desire that we have when someone does something to us. And what's the other option? The other option, again, is forgiveness. And forgiveness does not mean that you just say, oh, that's all right. You killed this person, just forget about it. Be nice in the future. No, we have something in the church that's called restorative justice. And the aim is not to punish someone for what they did, but to understand why what they did. And yes, it might involve punishment, but for the sake of forgiveness, so that they can be reintroduced into society for whatever crime or whatever penalty that they've done. And some people, obviously, they never can learn, and they probably need to be locked up for the rest of their lives. But for others, our call as Catholic Christians is to always be forgiving. And when we think about something like the person who was killed at the 7-Eleven, we can think, well, that's not my concern. That's something that the state of California will take care of, and that's about them. But we are the state of California. It's interesting. I got my ballot in the mail, and you have all these judges that we're supposed to vote for, and I have no idea about who to vote for with these judges. And I think something for us as Catholic Christians is to study on those judges and to see who would be more reflective of our values as Catholic Christians. Who would be someone who's more willing to forgive, or someone who's more desirous of throwing people away and locking people up and throwing away the key. I think that's our challenge as Catholic Christians. But in thinking about it even more personally, because this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I think most of us don't act that way. But the thing at least I do is I treat people the way they treat me. If someone comes up to me and they're nice to me, I'm going to be nice to them. If I'm again on the 605 and someone, lets me get in when I want to make that right-hand turn, I'll be nice to the next guy. But if someone cuts me off, or if someone speaks, someone swears at me or whatever, someone gets me mad, my tendency is to react the same way, to treat people the way that they treat me. And Jesus is calling us to something more. And then, as I said, it gets even harder. Jesus says to love your enemies and do good for those who hate you. And he says it has been said before that you love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And thinking about it, if we're called to love our enemies, I mean, really, it doesn't make any sense. Because our enemies, well, they hate us, right? And if I love my enemy, well, they're no longer going to be my enemy. And I think that's exactly what Jesus wants us to do. You know, in this world in which we live, we're talking more and more about divisions. You know, it's us and it's them. It's the Democrats, it's the Republicans. It's the inside and the outside. And what Jesus is challenging us to do is to see everyone as everyone as our brothers and sisters. And is it easy? No, of course it isn't. But that's why we come together as a church, to offer one another that support that we need in order to accept the challenge of the gospel. That's why we come together to receive the Eucharist, because we know what Jesus is asking us to do is not easy. And so we ask Jesus to give us that strength that we need in order to be what we are called to be. And then the ending, the clincher, to be perfect as God is perfect. You know, he doesn't say be perfect like Father Patrick is perfect, or be perfect even like Mother Teresa was perfect. He says be perfect like God is perfect. How is that even possible? How is it possible for any one of us to be perfect, much less like God is perfect? You know, as I was thinking about it, last Saturday I was talking to Alicia's mom. And Alicia's mom talks Spanish, and she was saying to me, she said, because I'd given a talk, and she says to me, Padre, su español es perfecto. And the truth is, my Spanish is not perfect. You know, she said, ni tiene acento, and that's also not true. I have an accent when I speak Spanish. My Spanish, it isn't perfect, but because I speak Spanish, it gets a little better all the time. You know, because I use my Spanish, I think I do pretty good when I speak Spanish. I know it's not perfect, and it never will be perfect, but I continue to try. You know, I also speak Portuguese, but I never get the opportunity to use Portuguese. Yesterday at the LA conference, I ran into a couple that I was in Brazil with in 1998, and I was talking to them a little bit in Portuguese, and after about 2 or 3 sentences, I got completely lost. Because I don't have the opportunity to use my Spanish, my Portuguese. So I'm losing it. But because I speak Spanish, because I'm practicing it, it gets better and better. And I think that's the key to being followers of Jesus Christ. Is Jesus calls us to forgive those who hurt us. To love not just our neighbors, but to love everyone. And the way to do it is not by saying it's impossible. It's by practicing it. Practicing it in small ways, by beginning the journey that Jesus has called us to follow. I don't know, has anyone here seen that movie, Mr. Rogers, with Tom Hanks? Nobody? A couple people? I don't know if it's the greatest movie in the world, but Mr. Rogers is one of the greatest persons in the world. I mean, it's worth seeing it just to see more about the life of this Mr. Rogers. But in the middle of this movie, there's a scene where the reporter who's writing the story about Mr. Rogers, he's interviewing Mr. Rogers' wife. And he says to her, how is it being married to someone who is a saint? And she responds and she says, no, don't do that. She says, he is not a saint. He gets angry just like the rest of us. He loses his patience. Sometimes he yells at the kids. But the thing is, he tries to use his anger and his lack of patience in a different way. She says it's a practice. What Mr. Rogers is doing is a practice. What Jesus is calling us to is to a practice. It is not easy. If we go out of here tonight thinking, yeah, I'm going to be perfect, just like God is perfect, well, obviously we've missed the point. But if we go out of here saying, you know, this week I'm going to try to be a little bit more perfect. And I have these 100 or so people who came to church with me tonight who are going to pray for me that I can be more perfect, and I'm going to pray for them. And I have the strength of the Eucharist here as well that comes in and dwells within me to help me to be perfect. What Jesus is challenging us to do is never easy. And that's why he gives us so many helps for us on the way to salvation. The Christian community that we form together and the sacraments that we've come together to share. Jesus invites us to be perfect as God is perfect. And as we continue to practice, we know that we are on the way. We are on the way to perfection.